The lecture hall buzzed with the characteristic chittering of young Vrexian cubs, a sound that resembled wind chimes made of chitin and glass. Professor Thelvax stood at the podium, his four eyes narrowed in concentration as he prepared to begin his advanced theoretical physics seminar. This was graduate-level material, meant for the most promising minds in the Galactic Consortium's educational system. The door hissed open. Kayla Martinez walked in, coffee in one hand, datapad in the other, completely oblivious to the fact that she'd just entered the wrong building. She was supposed to be in Human Studies, 103 buildings over, but the campus map on her datapad had glitched, and she'd been running late. After her shuttle arrived behind schedule, she looked around at the sea of crystalline faces staring at her with compound eyes. Shrugged internally, this was an alien university. After Alan took a seat in the back row, the chairs were slightly too small, designed for the Vrexian frame, but Kayla had learned to adapt during her first week on Crystallis Prime. Professor Thelvax clicked his mandibles in what might have been confusion or annoyance, but decided not to interrupt his lecture schedule. Humans were supposedly enrolling in more diverse programs now. Perhaps this was a sign of their species' growing intellectual ambition. Today, Thelvax began, his voice emanating from a translator implant. We will discuss the Carthan paradox, the theoretical impossibility of faster-than-light communication without causal violation. Kayla perked up, taking a sip of her coffee. She'd always been fascinated by physics, even if she was technically a xenanthropology major. Her brother Caleb was the physicist in the family, always sending her articles about quantum mechanics and wormhole theories. The professor continued, projecting complex mathematical formulae onto the holographic display. The Vrexian cubs, each about the size of a large dog, with bodies like living sculptures of amber and amethyst, leaned forward, their antennae quivering with concentration. The fundamental problem, Thelvax explained, is that any signal traveling faster than light would, in essence, be traveling backward in time relative to certain reference frames. This creates the grandfather paradox on a universal scale. Kayla frowned. She raised her hand. The lecture hall fell silent. Raising one's hand was not Vrexian custom. They typically broadcasted their questions through pheromone signals. But Professor Thelvax had been trained in multi-species pedagogy. Yes, human Kayla, she offered. I'm sorry, but couldn't you theoretically solve that by treating causality as local rather than universal? If you assume that different regions of spacetime maintain their own causal consistency, then FTL communication wouldn't necessarily create paradoxes, it would just create isolated causal networks. The professor's antennae stood straight up. Several cubs turned their crystalline heads to stare at Kayla with renewed interest. Is an interesting hypothesis, Thelvax admitted, but it fails to account for the intersection points where these causal networks would need to interact. The mathematical inconsistencies would be, unless you introduce a buffer system. Kayla interrupted, warming to the topic. Her brother had ranted about this exact problem for hours during their last video call, like quantum decoherence but for causal relationships. Each network maintains internal consistency while allowing for controlled information exchange at the boundaries. She grabbed her datapad and started sketching a rough diagram. Think of it like watertight compartments on a ship. Even if one floods, the others stay intact. Causality could work the same way, compartmentalized but connected. One of the Vrexian cubs in the front row chirped excitedly, his juvenile voice translator crackling. But human Kayla, how would you prevent causal leakage at the boundary intersections? Kayla grinned. Same way you prevent quantum decoherence, controlled observation and measurement. You'd need a regulatory mechanism, probably artificial, that manages information flow between causal zones. Another cub joined in, her crystalline body practically vibrating, like a causal firewall. Exactly. Kayla laughed. Professor Thelvax found himself standing at the podium, watching as his lecture hall transformed into a collaborative brainstorming session. The cubs, young Vrexians who would normally defer entirely to professorial authority, were now actively debating with this human, building on her ideas, proposing modifications and extensions. That it was unprecedented. For the next 40 minutes, the lecture became a free-flowing discussion. Kayla found herself drawing diagrams, explaining concepts she'd only half understood from her brother's rambling explanations, somehow making them clearer in the process of teaching. The Vrexian cubs, freed from the typical rigid structure of their education, blossomed. They asked questions, challenged assumptions, proposed wild theories. One cub named Zixtal suggested that causal networks might explain dark matter. Another named Velrin wondered if consciousness itself was a kind of causal boundary. Kayla encouraged every idea, even the ones that made no sense, helping them work through the logic. Professor Thelvax realized he'd witnessed something remarkable. Humans didn't just learn, they catalyzed learning in others. When the session finally ended, the cubs surrounded Kayla, chittering excitedly, asking if she'd be attending the next lecture. She glanced at her datapad, and her eyes widened. "Oh no," she muttered. "I'm in the wrong building. I was supposed to be in Human Studies 101." The cubs fell silent. Then, as one, they began chittering, in what Kayla would later learn was laughter. Professor Thelvax approached, his mandibles clicking in amusement. "Human Kayla, I believe you may have taught more in one session than I have in the past month. Would you consider auditing this course? Your perspective is quite valuable." Kayla looked around at the eager crystalline faces staring up at her. She thought about her brother Caleb, who'd be absolutely thrilled to hear about this. She thought about her actual major, xenanthropology, and realized that understanding alien physics might actually help her understand alien cultures. "You know what?" she said, grinning. "Yeah, I think I will." As she left the lecture hall, she pulled out her communicator to call Caleb. He answered on the second ring, his face appearing on the small screen. "Kayla, how's Alien University?" "Well," she said, unable to contain her smile. "I just accidentally taught a graduate physics seminar to a bunch of alien cubs." Caleb blinked. "You what?" "Long story, Cal. I think I'm going to need you to send me all your quantum mechanics notes." "Why?" "Because apparently, I'm teaching advanced physics now." Behind her, through the lecture hall windows, she could see the Vrexian cubs still gathered in excited clusters, their bodies glowing with bioluminescent enthusiasm as they debated the ideas she'd sparked. Professor Thelvax watched them and clicked his mandibles, thoughtfully. Perhaps humanity's greatest contribution to the Galactic Consortium wasn't their technology or their military prowess. Perhaps it was something simpler and more profound. Their infectious curiosity and their absolute refusal to accept that any room was the wrong room for learning. The cubs had sat down like it was their class because, in the presence of that very human enthusiasm, it had become exactly that.